Hi, family. Welcome back to the Psychedelic Scene podcast. I'm your host, Jill Sitnik. I'm your psychedelic big sister. And today's guest is Andrew Weiss, and he is running a beautiful blog over on Substack. And he's talking about an area of psychedelics that I don't think is mentioned enough, and that's the after. You know, in the psychedelic community, we talk a lot about which medicine, which dosage, where your journey is, who your facilitators are, what your goals are. And sometimes I think we skip over the, hey, this is how you've been changed and this is how you're going to live your life differently. And so that's where Andrew focuses. So we're just having a general chat about his experiences, how he came to psychedelics, what he's doing with the blog and what his goals are. And so sit back and enjoy. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Psychedelic Scene podcast. And today we have a very interesting discussion about psychedelics, grief, and kind of what comes after the journey. And I'm looking forward to chatting with my guest, Andrew Weiss. And I'm going to read the fabulous bio because you're going to want to check him out after we're done. Andrew Weiss is the writer behind the Psychedelic blog. It's a weekly publication that explores how psychedelics shape grieving, relationships, culture, and death. He started his career on Wall Street. That's a whole other topic, right? He started his career on Wall Street, then spent over a decade building and scaling sales teams in health tech. And after losing both of his siblings, he turned to psychedelics as a way to heal, and that experience completely transformed how he sees life, loss, consciousness itself, kind of like how a lot of us go through that. And today he writes and speaks about the deeper impacts of these medicines, and not just how they heal us, but how they change the way we show up for others and we serve the collective. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you, Jill. I'm super excited to be here.
As we chatted before this session, I think the conversation kind of gets hyper-focused around the healing experience and the actual process. And there isn't enough conversation about, hey, there is an after.
Yeah.
You achieve a certain goal and then there is an after. So I'm really looking forward to this. So why don't you introduce yourself to our audience and give us your origin story? How the heck do you find yourself talking about yourself on the Psychedelic Scene podcast?
Yeah. I didn't envision this as a child. Life took me down this path. It was actually my origin story probably is circa 2018, 19. You'll remember that's when Michael Pollan's, How to Change Your Mind book, came out. It was gifted to me by my girlfriend at the time. And like many people, prior to reading that book, my association with psychedelics was, drugs you do in college, right? Like I had zero understanding of the history of the growing science around how they can help cure, myriad of different diseases. And in this kind of like very serendipitous way, a few months, maybe a year after reading that book, a friend of mine in the gym had mentioned they were going to a psychedelic ceremony. I'm someone that's always been wired for curiosity and the big five, personality test. Like I'm off the charts in openness to new experience. So I was like all in, let's go. And I remember actually on the car ride to the ceremony, I asked her like, what are we doing today? And she's like, you didn't read the emails and the pamphlet? I'm like, no, I'm not going to read these emails. And she's like, today's the toad. And I immediately from the book, I knew what that meant. So, my origin story is I started at the highest level of the video game with 5-MeO DMT, which is, the active ingredient in buco bears. And I had this incredibly powerful mystical experience. This was 5 years after I had lost my sister. I was still struggling with a lot of grief. Some things that happened during that event converted a lifelong atheist into a believer, someone who was always wired for science and evidence, and I still am to a great degree, but it destabilized all of my frameworks and rational way of understanding the world. And then a year later, I started, or would have been 2 years later, I started the blog, and since then I've spent, the better part of 6 years just going really deep into this world, spending time with healers and shamans and working with all the different psychedelics, and it's been quite the adventure.
Well, as soon as you said you started with 5.
Yeah. I didn't think that through.
On the other hand, your experience is very similar to a whole lot of other folks that just say, hey, it's a psychedelic, and they don't really know that there's a difference between different psychedelics. And if that's a story that maybe motivates people to read the email, that would be very good.
Yeah. Yeah. Mine is a cautionary tale of what not to do. I now recommend, if someone is interested in this modality, of psychedelics broadly, there are better entry points, a low to medium dose psilocybin, taking some MDMA, with your partner. These are better entry points to altered states of consciousness than to achieve the transcendence and mystical unity that Bufo can often catalyze.
You know what I always say to folks, do you want to, the very first time that you go swimming, do you want to jump in the deep end, or do you just kind of like want to walk down the stairs into the pool? So it's a really good analogy.
Yeah.
So tell me, I jumped over to the Substack to check it out. I'm loving it because it captures a whole bunch of different angles, and so many people, myself included, I focus on one thing. I focus on MDMA therapy. You have this kind of broad range. What sent you the Substack? How are you finding writing the blog? What's your experience with it?
Yeah, well, thank you for the kind words. I've loved Substack. I was there actually before they rolled out their notes version, which is like their version of Twitter, ostensibly. And I've been able to find just amazing writers, some psychedelic focused, but just on a broad array of topics, really smart people. And the notes part of their platform allows you to kind of reshare your work, engage, post, collaborate, and so it's really helped just kind of fuel really levels of growth that I didn't anticipate happening over the course of a few years. So yeah, and I think what I tried to bring, I think the fact that I kind of have a more of a corporate background and I've always been just very data and evidence based. I think bringing that to the psychedelic world, which can, has the association of being a little more woo woo and spiritual. Yeah, I'm trying to strike that balance between like, okay, what is the marriage of the science and the data versus the ineffable and the mystical? Like that intersection is just fascinating to explore.
Oh, I agree. I mean, the irony is that there's robust conversations on all places like LinkedIn,
Yeah.
where, people are focused on the business side, obviously, but also focused on the research and, taking a little bit of the woo-woo out to say, hey, wait, this is actually how it impacts the brain.
Yeah.
What I really want to dive into, but I wanted to give the audience kind of an overview of you. You write very candidly about grief. You write very candidly about death, about consciousness. I think it very much similar to my experience. I had a death that kind of spiraled things. What are you finding as you're writing about these topics? Are they helping you with the grief? Are they prolonging it? What's your take on it?
Yeah, well, his name escapes me, but there was a French philosopher that has a recent quote that death has replaced sex as the new Western taboo. And it's true. I mean, we don't discuss death. And this, if you're like the fish in water, if you grew up in this culture, you might think that's normal. But if you do a quick scan across historical civilizations, death was at the forefront of the dialogue. Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics, Memento Mori, think about that you're going to die. The Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece, this who's who of Socrates and Aristotle, they'd all get together and drink what we now think is a psychedelic brew. And the whole purpose of the trip was to kind of ponder on your own mortality. So, the infusion of death as something that you can talk about in culture is certainly novel to the West. I've joked that like, if you try to bring that up at your kid's little league game, like it would be like bringing up your sex life. Like it would not be received. They'd be like, who is this weirdo? Who invited them? um, and I don't think that's a good thing because it is inevitable. And as unfortunately you've experienced and as I've experienced, sometimes it happens when we least expect it. And so I think driving this conversation, yeah, I mean, I just think it's important. And I think also psychedelic experiences, especially as we get into the more what I call like tier one, the potents, the ayahuascas, the bufos of the world, where there does seem to be a mirroring or a lot of parallels to reports you read from people that have had, NDEs, near-death experiences. Why not prepare? Like this is the one thing you're going to have to do. Maybe a little bit of preparation isn't the worst idea.
That is spectacular because it's so funny. I've had a similar kind of thinking of this is going to be very similar. I will validate you in that in the West. I'm in Pennsylvania.
Yep.
We do not handle grief well. I went to a therapist. I didn't have any concept of therapy. I went to a therapist and I treated myself to processing my grief with someone because it's just not something we do well. You know, you get what, 3 to 5 days off of work, and then you're supposed to just be normal. And, deep, deep grief it's a mountain. It's a mountain is kind of the way I like to say it. So has working with psychedelics eased your fear of death?
Unequivocally. I think there's always a caveat that there is the uh I challenge myself to think like, I fly a good amount, right? And I like to think that these experiences I've had have ameliorated the natural fear of death that we have. I think they've helped me with closure with the people that I've lost to early deaths. But I also wonder, like, if I'm on the airplane and there's a huge jolt of turbulence and the air mask comes down, will I have the exact same human experience as everyone else on that plane? I mean, you don't know until you're in that situation. I'd like to think that these experiences have certainly lessened the fear of death, but actually I think maybe they're more impactful takeaway from these experiences is that, like, we're going to go there. Like, they serve as a very poignant and sometimes terrifying and beautiful and sometimes all on the same journey, reminder that this is an ephemeral existence. We're not here for nearly as long as we probably think we are. And I think that just forces you to live, like, when you know that, like, that this things are going good in life, whether it's, serendipity in work or your romantic life, like, all of this is going to end. It's a little bit, I guess, Buddhist-esque in that regard. So I think they probably have lessened my fear of death, but I would say the more impactful download, to use psychedelic vernacular, is they've just made me feel more alive.
Oh, it's interesting. They bring a sense of the present and existence. I tend to just describe it to people as I'm not necessarily afraid of the death part. I'm afraid of the process of it. I don't want to feel the pain. I don't want, the physical part, I think, is completely natural, that it's going to be scary. We don't know what's happening. We don't want to experience discomfort, things of that sort. But psychedelics have absolutely made me far less, they've changed my whole kind of vision of the universe too. And so there's an interesting, I'm a little afraid of the process. I'm not necessarily afraid of the finish line kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really well said. Yeah, I aligned with that.
So you had these
Mhm.
losses, you're experiencing grief, you are using psychedelics, you're finding kind of some different viewpoints. I think that's very much the story of lots of folks. And one of the things you explore in the on the Substack is that there is an after.
Yeah.
And how do you live your life in the after? Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I think somewhere along, the journey, I started to realize that on a cultural level, and this isn't just specific to psychedelics, I think just broadly, like, there's different ways to capture, whether you call it therapy culture, healing culture, like, there is this kind of cultural incentive we put around staying in the pain, and, constantly, like, doing the work and, break the trauma. There's all the, if you scroll on social media, there's a lot of, like, mantras and platitudes about, how it's so brave to, like, do the work, and I wholeheartely agree. Like, and I am living proof that, going and doing hard things, and whether it's therapy or psychedelics or, physical training, meditation, breath work, there's all these modalities. We live in an amazing time of, like, decentralized information where you can learn about different ways to heal and move on. But what I started to kind of, realize was that there is nothing about the after. Like, it's all about stay in this place. And, I think that's, I mean, if I'll be on brand and candid, like, that will eventually lead to a wasted life. Like, no, life should not be endless healing. It should not be endless validation of your emotions, endless inwardly focused themes about you. At some point, the narrative has to shift to, how we show up in the world. How are we as romantic partners? Do we, work at a food bank? Do we say something, go out of our way to say something kind? to the person that we think needs to hear it the most. And these like little, benevolent acts that can be really meaningful, stretch out over the course of a lifetime. Like there's so little about that and so much about like, your trauma is valid. And I felt like, especially growing an audience in psychedelics, it was important that, we do understand that like if the intention is healing, and I think for really potent psychedelics, it usually is, curiosity too, but um, like there has to be an end game there at some point, or else at some point we're getting into the spiritual narcissism where you're just, you're doing this because it's all about you. And, I think there is a little bit of a perverse incentive where if you are perpetually doing the work, well, then no one can count on you. No one can rely on you. And then that kind of creates like a blanket of, and it can mask, not ideal behavior. So yeah, I'm pretty transparent that like at some point, yeah, it's time to, externally focus our lives on how we can, just be a source of good in the world.
One of the analogies I give to folks, because when you're, for folks who have, or legitimately on the, or at least in the beginning of the trauma healing journey, things of that sort, what I'll say to them is imagine this, because this is what came to me. This is what helped me. Imagine a jar. I think of a mason jar, and it's full of dirt. And your first psychedelic experience kind of takes a little bit of that dirt out, and you're like, oh, wow, this can actually work. Huh. Well, if you continue to take the dirt out, you're eventually going to have a beautifully clean jar. What I sometimes find people doing is going into the jar and just stirring the dirt. That if you don't actually make the conscious decision to change, to use the perspective shifting ability that psychedelics give you, you're just going to be stirring the dirt, and you're in some ways, I'm going to use the phrasing, you're not doing the hard work. You might be observing what the issues are, but you're not making the changes to then live your life in a better way. And I've seen that a few times.
Yeah, I think I love the analogy, and I think this is where integration is just paramount. And I don't think there's one, integration protocol that is best. There's some really good ones out there, but um, to me, my definition of integration is like taking the lessons you learned from your journey from the psychedelic. Like it's also a way, if we want to go more in the spiritual lens, like a way to express gratitude for the medicine. Um, and gifting you these insights and these levels of unprecedented clarity, a way to express gratitude for the medicine doing that for us, is integrating it by how we show up in the world, and just becoming someone that's like kinder, lighter. Like we all know, when you're at a party, and either whether it's a couple or someone walks in that's just operating on a different frequency where you can just tell they're light, they're happy, they're blissful, they're peaceful. Like I used to see those people in my life before my psychedelic journey and just like always wonder like how did they, how are they like that? And listen, some people are just born that way. They have naturally higher serotonin, that they don't deal with a lot of trauma. They loving families, and that's amazing. But for many of us, that wasn't our path. And we do need something external to help us get to that point. But once you get to that point, it is important to shed the healing skin, and and just be that person. And I write a lot about just being useful and reliable, like two very simple themes, but that's integrating, a psychedelic experience, like being someone that people can count on is no small feat.
Well, and I think that ties really well into purpose. And let's dive into, your Substack. I find, as somebody deeply in this community, I find the Substack really interesting. What was the underlying purpose of, getting that started?
That's a good question. I think I've always kind of had this desire to create in some way. Um, Luckily for the whole world, I didn't pursue singing or paint. I couldn't paint between the lines when I was a kid. Like I have zero artistic ability, but I love to storytell. Back when I was building sales teams in tech, like I hated the spreadsheets and the forecasting and all the math and the minutia. But when I had to like give a speech at a company all hands meeting, like I was fired up. So I love storytelling. I had this kind of burning ember to like create something. And so, to me, like what more of an interesting, avenue to explore and write about than, the frontiers of human consciousness. And then it compounds, right? Like once you read, How to Change Your Mind, and then you read a critique of that book, and then you go and actually speak to a shaman. And like the more you go into this world, you realize like, oh my God, it is so layered and deep, and there's so many things I didn't know, and I'm still learning, 7 years in now. So yeah, I think that the desire was creativity, and I can't sing or paint or dance, so this was the best bet I had.
I was the same way in my tech world. Leave that data cube behind, but get me up in front of customers or get me up in front of fellow salespeople, and like I am there.
Awesome.
You know, one of the things that is a little bit of the psychedelic stereotype that I've put a lot of thought into is, oh, you did healing and now you think you're going to go heal the world. This kind of stereotype of, I now see something that nobody else sees and I need to somehow impact. I work really hard to make sure I keep my ego in check. I have a lot of friends who would never touch psychedelics. I don't ever want to get to that point. I can identify pretty quickly when I'm seeing somebody who doesn't have their ego in check. Can you speak to the idea of how our listeners, some of whom are novices, some of whom are experts, how can they get a read on folks who their purpose is to help, their purpose is to educate, their purpose is to, in some way, shape, or form, be kind, versus the purpose is, hey, it's all about me and what I can do for you in like a very selfish way?
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a real challenge. And I think there are, in the spiritual psychedelic world, there are a lot of people. I mean, any movement's going to attract like nefarious people with nefarious intent or nefarious underlying motivations. But I think this one is especially porous to that archetype, because it is one built on, you know, things like kindness and love and spirituality. And, I can see things that you can't, like, yeah, if you are someone that is, in the dark triad personality type, like you're salivating at these at the entry point here, because it is, too good to be true. So I think in terms of discernment, which I believe is kind of at the crux of your question. I mean, it's always difficult, because people that, are not well intended are usually really good at cosplaying as they are. So I don't know. I think to me, it's a little bit of a mixture of like humility, and transparency. Like, I did a post recently that if, someone says, oh, hey, I had this like mystical psychedelic experience and now I can't relate to anyone. Well, like you're downloading the wrong message. Like that's, a hidden version of reality that most people go their whole lives without ever seeing. Maybe they see it, in the next realm, was revealed to you. What you do with that, I think, reveals a lot about you as a person. If that amazing experience leads you to think that like, oh, these people are low energy and they're just not my vibe now because I've done this thing, then like you're not really understanding, what these medicines are about, or what they're trying to teach you. So I think that can be, in of itself, one red flag. I think another kind of tool in the toolkit of discernment is, do they sanitize like the history and actually uses of these medicines? Like I've been a little bit taken aback at times where people with like massive followings will post about ayahuasca as if it was a healing medicine for centuries, and the actual history of ayahuasca is far more dark. It was used for sorcery and seduction and control, and shamans warring with one another. So like, if you're getting your advice from someone who tells you that ayahuasca has been healing people for 10,000 years, A, it probably only goes back about 500. B, like that's a very, that's someone who actually hasn't read the B side and then, they've just kind of, realized they could build a following and write or tell stories or even be healers and on the ground doing this. That's someone who has a very entry level understanding of these missions. So yeah, what are the messages being downloaded, and how in touch are they with the actual history of these psychedelics? To me, is very revealing, and if they're high integrity, and if their heart's in the right place.
And I think too, the word healing, I feel like we need, like, how the Eskimos have, so many words for clouds. I think we are lacking in our Western world of different words for healing, because can anybody go do an ayahuasca journey in the middle of the jungle and feel some sort of healing potentially. Is that the level of a therapeutic journey? I'm not sure, and people could argue back and forth things of that sort. So I wish I wish we had broader words. Maybe we'll wind up doing that, right?
Yeah.
Well, so when you're having this conversation about, the reliability of the people with whom you're speaking, or just communicating in general, how have psychedelics, you've hinted at it a few times, impacted, your sense of intimacy, your sense of compassion, your sense of openness to other folks? Because that's been a recurring theme throughout the Substack articles.
Yeah, I think it's undeniable that they change certain levels of intuition and energy detection. Now I think I've someone that's always had a fair high amount of intuition, but these experiences have made me like far more kind of grounded, more compassionate, more understanding, but also, equally more discerning. But even if I just take myself out of the equation, I have a friend here. I live in Puerto Vallarta in Mexico, and I have a friend here who's a healer, and he's worked with plant medicine for 30 years. An older gentleman, great guy, and he is from Italy, and so he grew up going to all the sites as a kid, but after 30 years working with plant medicine, he went to the Colosseum on a trip back to Italy to see family, and like he said, like it broke him, and he said something about if you just think of the amount of death and violence and horrors that happened in that building over the course of hundreds of years, like it's unfathomable in the modern era to think of what transpired there. And this person is now operating on a frequency where just the historical residue of that terror like impacted him, where he like cried, broke down, and had to leave like immediately. So clearly, and this gets in a little bit to the ineffable and the woo-woo part of psychedelics, which I also love. So it's hard to like falsify and quantify. But clearly these medicines, especially when done with intention and reverence over the course of several years or even decades, they do change how we operate. And I find myself just, a lot more sensitive to energy in ways that I don't think I was, 10 years ago.
Oh, 1,000%. And being able to separate if someone has an unhealed energy or someone has a really aggressive energy, or for me, I'm finding a lot of anxious energy, the ability to see it, not react to it, and still maintain my energy, which I would say before psychedelics was 1,000% more challenging. I would kind of pick up on the energy of the room or try to match it or try to even calm it down, versus now there's just a compassion for folks in terms of where they are on their own journey. And I'm here on my journey, and I'm not going to step on you. I'm not going to put my hand in your wet paint or anything of that sort. I'm going to let you exist. And I think there's a compassion around not trying to impact others, especially when they're not ready.
Well, I think, Jill, you're also articulating like our heightened level of awareness of like, hey, I'm feeling this way. That's almost like Eckhart Tolle witness level. Like I'm feeling this way because, maybe, I'm sensing this anxiety, but how I manage that is to not try to control or manipulate the situation to my favor, but to just understand from a compassionate lens that this is the way people are wired. Like, I think that's a profound level. That's a great way to just kind of navigate life in general.
Well, and I think that's part of the after that you talk about. And I try to explain to folks that you're going to have your memories and you're still going to interact with people. And then there's a but you're not the person before. You're the person now who can recognize patterns and change your behavior and not be reactive, instead be purposeful. And I think that's one of the elements there.
Yeah.
So what question, this is my favorite question. This is actually a question I always ask in all my sales meetings, so watch out. What question have I not asked?
That is a good one.
Yeah.
Steal that. What have I not asked? Well, you have to, just to be transparent, you've asked some really good questions. And I love this conversation. I think one thing that maybe we didn't explore, and we could attribute that to not asking, is like the nuance of the various different psychedelics. Because, listen, I'm guilty of this. My blog is the psychedelic blog, but there are, I made this analogy that, like, comparing Bufo to a medium dose of psilocybin would be like driving a Ferrari versus, a Honda. And, I think there is a real deficit of knowledge in the space. Like, so many times I'll be listening to a podcast with someone that I really like, and someone will ask them, like, well, what about psychedelics? And they'll say, well, they do this, this, and this. And they never pause to say, well, wait, which one? Like, ketamine is a vastly different experience than changa, which is a vastly different experience as MDMA, which you know very well. So there's so much nuance, I think, missing from the conversation. So if I have to, yeah, that would be my best answer to your really good question, which is like, why would someone, like, how does someone choose? If there is someone in your audience that is like newer, that's curious, out of healing, maybe they're like stuck in a rut in life, and they think that there's a mystical experience, or an altered state of consciousness could be, beneficial in some way. Like, where do they start? How do they choose which one? So I think that's the best I can do. It's a good question.
Okay, so first of all, phenomenal answer and completely true. People, I've said before, you go to you don't say, "Hey, there's a prescription strength drug." Just go take a prescription strength drug. Obviously, there are different drugs for different ailments, and there are different psychedelics that work. I should say there are psychedelics that work differently. I went through a process. Obviously, I started my PTSD healing with MDMA, and then with the CPTSD, I purposely went and worked with a variety of medicines to understand how they work with trauma. And it's given me the clarity that if somebody is their nervous system is in a crisis state, personally, I'm going to always suggest MDMA.
Yeah.
If their nervous system is not in a crisis state, and then you have to pay attention to what their health issues are, their timing is, what they want to achieve, there are different psychedelics that fit into different slots. Yeah. Hey, gosh, maybe we just gave you a couple of blog posts in terms of how do you, I almost feel like there should be some sort of like checklist that, maybe we start to think about in this community, because even to the extent of, I had a client who decided to do a psilocybin journey and happened to choose a strand of psilocybin that was like way up there. And people don't even understand dosing. They don't understand the chemicals. The umbrella of psychedelic has, I don't even know how to finish that analogy. It's
vast.
There's so many components. It's vast.
It's vast. Yeah.
It's vast.
Even intra psilocybin, there's, golden teacher all the way up. Like, there's so many different potential experiences and outcomes to be aware of. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, so from the audience, and the audience is saying, oh my gosh, I subscribe to so many newsletters and I'm attached to this and that, the other thing. What's the reader? What kind of reader is saying, I'm going to go subscribe to Andrew's Substack because I'm going to get XYZ? Like, who is really going to benefit other than me? Who's your kind of the reader that you're kind of looking to help?
Yeah, I've actually ever even really like, I'm so focused on like writing things that I believe are super thought provoking and educational and helpful. If I kind of do the paradigm shift of who benefits the most, I think where my blog, way I come to the answer is, okay, what am I offering that other people aren't? Maybe that's like a very Wall Street or tech paradigm that I still, like a relic from my past life, that I'm holding on to. But what do I offer that I think other newsletters in this space, spirituality, consciousness, relationships, psychedelics, what are they? And I think I spend an inordinate amount of time, like this is now my full-time job. I spend a incredible amount of time like digging through the data, the research. I've read, it's over 1,000, probably over 2,000 trip reports. Every new study that comes out on DMT or Bufo, or, I'm reading, I'm going into it. But because there's plenty of newsletters, that could just pump out the case studies and the updates, and, now psilocybin works for alcoholism. And, I'm taking all that information that I'm kind of just this voraciously curious person, but I'm constantly infusing that with personal experience. And I think there's some things in life where like personal experience not only matters, it's like a necessity. Like travel advice. Like I wouldn't take travel advice from someone who's never been to the place they've said, you'll never see me write an article on childbirth because I'm just not going to have that experience. Like, I think war is another one. Someone who's experienced war, like, they're going to have an understanding of what a combat experience is like, that only they know. And I think a psychedelic experience, by definition, is in that cohort of experiences that if the person hasn't done it themselves, then I'm sorry, their opinion is a little bit textbook. It's a little bit academic. And so I think a potential reader, to finally answer your question in a kind of roundabout way, I think who would stand to benefit is someone who understands that when it comes to a psychedelic experience, whether it's MDMA all the way to Bufo, you definitely want to familiarize yourself with someone who's been there and done it. Now, that doesn't mean, to caveat that doesn't mean it's going to map perfectly onto your experience. In fact, it might not. But having a little bit of just an understanding of like, okay, like, this person did that. Like, I went to Russia about 10 years ago, and I was kind of nervous. I did like the Trans-Siberian Railroad and the Weisse. They were telling me like, cover your tattoos, and and when you're outside of the major cities, pretend you're a deaf mute, because if you reveal that you're an American, they might try to rob you. I ended up having a wonderful time, and they were so lovely. But the point was, like, before I went to Russia, the only thing I read was like people who had been to Russia, and I think that's my value in the psychedelic blog. It's a lot of science, it's a lot of data, but it's all married with personal experience.
Oh my gosh, you just described my life. I came out of my third journey and said, I need to take my corporate skills and explain this to people, because the researchers are not explaining it in a real world way and what you're experiencing. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of getting your information, obviously for researchers and aggregators and things of that sort, but talking to people who can coherently, and not even with a data background, but coherently explain what things are, understanding the data in the back end, I think is very, very important. And I think the stigma around psychedelics have stopped maybe voices like ours. Like, I just pretty much, I was pivoting out of the corporate world anyway. But I think there needs to be more folks with the experience who can marry the mystical, the trauma stuff, and the research together to make it clear for people. I think that's the challenge. Your normal person who's thinking about doing a journey is not going to log on to a newsletter that is only talking about either the stocks involved or the patents or that kind of stuff. They need people like us who've done it and can explain it.
Yeah, and I think there's a void there. I think there's really smart people that will talk about psychedelics, but again, they'll speak about them as they're a catch-all, like one category of experience, which is lunacy. And then the world needs more people like you, Jill, because then what you have on the other side is the podcast host who has millions of subscribers, but they're equally as uneducated, so they don't know to challenge. Like, well, wait a minute, are you talking about ketamine now? Or are you talking about DMT? And so you end up with this kind of this rhythmic conversation of two people that are really not conveying the level of nuance and detail that something like a psychedelic experience certainly demands. So hopefully I'm helping to fill that void, and you certainly are.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you also don't get married to one medicine.
Yeah.
I see a lot of people who will, I know about psychedelics, and they've had 3 psilocybin journeys. I'm like, no, it's a little bit bigger.
Yeah.
All right.
It is.
Well, look,
Yeah.
I am a new subscriber to the Substack. I am very excited to kind of meet a common soul here who has very much the same kind of goals about helping people understand this modality. I want to thank you for joining me today. Are there any closing words on your end to our listeners?
No, I just think that I'm just very grateful for the opportunity, Jill, and I think the work you're doing is awesome. Like, more conversations like this that are detailed and nuanced and going beneath the iceberg and beneath people's first impression of psychedelics are so important. So thank you.
Awesome. All right. We will chat soon.
All right. Thank you.
There you go, family. Thanks so much for hanging out with me and Andrew. I thought it was a delightful conversation. And I love that more and more folks are thinking about the after the journey and how you show up in the world with your new insights. If you like this content, head on over to psychedelicscene.com. There is a ton of information over there feel free to buy Jason a little cup of coffee because he's the one who keeps the lights on. And as always, feel free to subscribe to this channel to get more psychedelic culture moving forward. And with that, until next time, take care.